Every day, you and I get bombarded with negative news. And just like our bodies becomes what we eat, our minds become the information that we consume. If you want to stay positive, it's so important that you also listen to stories that inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we interview world-leading experts dedicated to solving the world's most pressing problems. And if you stick around, I promise you will not only be as informed as if you watch the news, you will feel uplifted, inspired, and have more positive energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. Hi and welcome. Today, Great.com talks with Pamela Merritt, who is the Executive Director of Medical Students for Choice. And if you haven't heard of them before, they are a non-profit organization with a network of over 10,000 medical students and residents in 28 countries around the world. And they are on a mission to create tomorrow's abortion providers and pro-choice physicians. So if you're new here into this podcast, you definitely want to press subscribe, either on YouTube or in your podcast app, because today we're going to learn about abortions. Pamela, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, how would you describe Medical Students for Choice for someone that is not familiar with your organization?
Great question. So, Medical Students for Choice has chapters of medical students at med school, so at a university, and they are students who are interested in learning more about abortion, being trained on how to perform abortions, but they also want to be supported as they advocate with the administration of their school to make sure that they are getting the full, robust, most current education on reproductive health care. And that's actually an issue at a lot of universities that would rather avoid the politics or any political pushback about training doctors on how to perform abortion. And so a lot of med schools don't necessarily offer training as an option, or if they do, you have to kind of know that it's there and seek it out to it being an option, much like learning how to draw blood.
Got it. And that makes me think that this could be a good moment to zoom out a little bit. For someone that is not familiar with how the US works, could you talk a bit more about abortion in general in the US and what is happening in the country so we can understand why it's even a thing that some universities can't offer this kind of education?
Right. So the 1973 Supreme Court ruling, commonly referred to as Roe v. Wade, is what basically decriminalized and upheld an individual's right to privacy in their relationship with their physician in the United States. So 48 years ago, every state in the United States basically had to open up and allow for abortion to be legal. The trick, the devil is in the details, because what it also allowed is for states to make reasonable restrictions on abortion access. So some states in the United States are very conservative in their approach. They have legislatures that are against abortion. And so they have a lot of restrictions that they put in place that they argue are reasonable, but that most people would say are medically unnecessary, and therefore they're not reasonable. A good example of that situation would be where I live right now. I live in Southern Illinois, which is across the river, Mississippi River, from St. Louis, Missouri. So just 15 minutes drive from my home to St. Louis. Where I live, you can get an abortion. You don't have to wait. There are lots of clinics, certainly more than in Missouri, where you can choose from. There's actually 2 different providers within a 30-minute drive of my house in Illinois. In Missouri, the entire state, there is only one abortion provider. There's a mandatory 72-hour waiting period, and the restrictions go so deep that people can't even build new clinics because they even restrict the architecture of a clinic, how high the ceiling has to be in order for you to open up an abortion clinic. The other thing to understand is why we have the clinic structure. So we do not have doctors who can freely perform abortions in their medical offices, even though if you go to an abortion clinic, it's basically a medical office. But the restrictions, the unnecessary laws that have passed since 1973 basically have driven abortion into standalone clinics and have put this space, this distance between a hospital or a medical office and an abortion provider. And so when people are seeking abortion care, they can't just go to their regular doctor. They have to go to an abortion provider. And that extends even to medication abortion, which in some countries you can get medication abortion from your doctor. In the United States, in many states, you have to get it from directly from the doctor's office, as opposed to going to see a health center and getting.
Someone like me that is on a surface level familiar with the US system knows that it's conservative in some sense. And I guess that since the last legislation and the last president, it has become even more conservative. And now with Joe Biden, maybe things have changed. From your point of view that knows more in-depth knowledge here, how do you say that the attitudes have shifted when it comes to abortion in the US?
That's a fantastic question, because it really is one of the quirkiest things about American politics. So our political leaders are trending more and more conservative. You're absolutely right. Joe Biden is considered a moderate. He's not, as I'm a liberal and I'm very lefty. And he's far more moderate than I am. But the simple fact is that the majority of Americans support safe and legal access to abortion. 7 out of 10 Americans support access to abortion. And the reason it has become so politically restricted is it's a little complex, but I think I can give it to you in a pretty easy step. It's that a lot of the states have a lot of power to regulate who can vote. And they also are motivated to have an issue that convinces Americans to vote for one party, regardless of all the other issues in their life. So we have a lot of people who only vote on abortion. And that 10% can swing an election. And unfortunately, we have a lot of really tricky, clever politicians who have taken political power, even though the majority don't feel the way that they feel about abortion access. And they've benefited for far too long from people feeling shamed to talk about abortion. I know when I first started doing this work, you know, if I said abortion with in my full voice, people would wince. But but you know, there's a lot of stigma that has been advanced that we need to undo, because it doesn't make sense that 1 out of 3 people who can experience pregnancy will have an abortion in their lifetime. And for us to then also say it's not something people support. I can't think of very many things that 1 out of 3 people within a demographic are going to experience. But for some reason, we look at that and say, you know, but it's not supported. And it is supported. It's just become politically challenging to be upfront and vocal about it.
Thank you for that explanation. That makes a lot of sense to see now how some politicians have incentives to take a stand against abortion, even though the majority, maybe even of their voters, want that law to happen.
Yep.
That makes a lot of sense. So with politicians having that incentive, it makes sense also that some universities have restrictions, like you mentioned in the beginning of this interview. So help me then to understand how the medical students for choice play a part of the solution here in changing the system.
I'm happy to. So, Medical Students for Choice was actually founded in 1993 because of a tragedy. And it was founded shortly after the murder of Dr. David Gunn, who was an abortion provider. And he was shot and killed by somebody who opposed abortion. Shortly after his murder, we had a bunch of anti-abortion activists sent a mailing to medical students that had horrible jokes in it, making fun of the killing of this doctor and saying that if medical students continue to learn abortion and provide abortion, then they're going to have the same fate as the doctor who was murdered. So medical students, the doctors who formed Medical Students for Choice, or students, I should say, they were students then, were very angry and outraged by that mailing that went out. They formed the organization, and then basically it began as an organization to support fellow students who were interested in protesting and being activists for abortion rights. And then it expanded as our members began to realize that they were having a hard time getting access to training. Keep in mind that if Missouri only has one abortion provider and it's in St. Louis, then people who live 4 hours away and go to med school 4 hours away are going to have to travel to that clinic to train, because medicine is much, it's much like being a mechanic. If you're not ever in front of an engine, then you really can't learn what your trade is. So these medical students basically identified the barriers to training, which was access to in-clinic learning, that they were not being taught about abortion at conservative medical schools. For example, there are a lot of medical schools that are affiliated with the Catholic Church. The university might be a Catholic university, and then the med school will not teach about abortion or birth control. So our students, depending on where their chapter is, are advocating for a better education, for more access to training, and so that they will have the tools they need to provide the adequate care for the patients that they encounter. And even for those doctors who aren't going to be not going into obstetrics or gynecology, even doctors who want to go into family practice want to know about abortion because, as I said earlier, 1 in 3 people who experience pregnancy will have an abortion in their lifetime. So the odds are very high that even a family practitioner will encounter patients who have questions about abortion and need to know that their doctor has facts and not dogma to give them.
So what will the consequence be then for the patients that the students don't have access to the engine or the proper practice? Is it that fewer people will get the abortions? Is it that the ones that do will get lower quality abortions? Or is it both? What is the main problem you see?
The main problem that I see is that no matter that we have an expanded access to safe and effective abortion through medication abortion. It's one of those innovations that in countries like America, where it's hard to get in-clinic care, that access to medication abortion is a life changer. It really has changed the landscape. But we're talking about access that is limited to up to 12 weeks of pregnancy. And a lot of people don't even know they're pregnant until they're at least 6 weeks pregnant. The other fact is that a medication abortion isn't going to be the right choice for everyone. And my role as an activist is to make sure that people have the options that they are able to make the right choice for them, not a choice out of desperation, but out of what fits in their world. So no matter what happens in the United States or any country, people will need access to in-clinic care. And no matter what happens in the United States, people will have abortion. We know that abortion happened before 1973. Abortion is happening now, and no matter what happens to the legal framework, abortion will continue to be a necessary medical practice and practice that people have as long as people experience pregnancy. So what we're really talking about in the United States is that doctors will not be trained, and that will limit access to in-clinic care. And that actually will narrow the window of when people can make a decision about whether to continue their pregnancy. And so what we're pushing back on is the idea that abortion is somehow separate from healthcare. The other thing to keep in mind is that when I talk about abortion, I'm talking about abortion, I think, the way most people see it. There's a huge chunk of vocal minority in the United States of anti-abortion activists who think that birth control pills are abortion. They think that, people who have assisted technology with fertility are committing, some sort of sin against God. So talk about abortion, it's important to understand that politically, there are people who want to criminalize and ban access to anything that interrupts the fertilization of an egg. So it can be quite extreme. And without doctors, there is always a limited access to care. So our work is very intense, even though our students are they're very optimistic, but we know that there's a lot on the line here.
I really like your statement that abortion should not be seen as separate from healthcare. Mm-hmm. To me, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm also feel grateful that you, Pamela, have taken the time to speak with us today and give information on this topic. I can see that knowledge is a key here, and it is necessary for minds to start shift on this topic. Mm-hmm. So some are listening to this then, and they want to take some kind of positive action step to spread awareness, to do something to advance abortion laws in a more positive direction. What would be something they can do? Mm-hmm. From your point of view?
Ooh, I like that question. So there's a lot of different things that people can do. The first thing I recommend is that having those intimate conversations with friends and family about why you support abortion access, about why abortion is important to maintain bodily autonomy. That probably goes way further than the advocacy I do on a daily basis. It's harder to have those conversations because, at least in my community, people want to be very polite, and you can still be polite, but until we start openly talking about how we feel about restrictions and how we feel about how hard it is for people to access an abortion, or if you live in a country where people can access abortion, how has that impacted your community? What would happen if that went away? We need to talk about it openly, and that is a very powerful weapon against the stigma that people who oppose abortion are trying to push in advance. The other thing that we ask folks to do is that when you, particularly if you live in an environment that has a lot of restrictions on abortion access, speak up and be a part of the activism that's happening. So in the United States, in most of the states where there are restrictions, there are people who are working tirelessly to try and have those removed and to protect access to care. So find an organization like Planned Parenthood or NARAL. I know in Europe they have different names, but we definitely recommend finding a local group that is doing work and taking the action that you're comfortable with. So if that's calling politicians, then call a politician and ask them to protect access to abortion. If it's, filling out mailers and sending emails, then do that work. But if everybody who supported access to abortion and abortion rights took very simple steps of talking to their friends and family and taking action, we would not be in the situation we're in right now. So I know that that's the way we turn this situation around so that we can talk about and work on the other things that are impacting our society instead of trying to deny people access to healthcare.
I would love that shift in focus. So for you listening, be open, be bold, have the difficult conversations, get involved, be curious, and take positive action steps to start changing the mindset of people. Pamela, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I felt like I learned a lot. And I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for your enthusiasm and your energy.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about Medical Students for Choice with your audience.
Thank you. And for you listening, if you enjoyed this conversation, press subscribe either on YouTube or in your podcast app, because that is showing the algorithms that this is an important conversation so more people can learn about the importance of being open and bold in the fight for more positive abortion laws. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. What is great.com? That is the most common question that we get. And the shortest answer I can give you is that we are a company that is moving money from the online casino industry and donates it to charities that is helping the environment. The long answer, unfortunately, I don't have time to tell you today. But if you're curious, definitely Google what is great.com to learn more.